let's talk
Yes.
about buy versus build.
Technology, buy versus build.
Yeah.
So Experience Cloud we definitely look at as the buy approach, and there's a couple reasons for this mentality. So first off, I want to be clear, we're not saying that like you buy Experience Cloud and you automatically have a community. That like there are templates, there are starting points, but you are going to have to configure and set up your community. And to that point, like Mike, we've supported customers that have had like communities that had like full on Angular implementations inside of them, like very custom, very robust. So don't think of it as like, oh, I just buy it and the problem solved. But it is as close to that end of the spectrum as you're basically going to get. The reason I say that is Experience Cloud comes with their beautiful WYSIWYG design interface. For those of you who don't know or recognize without seeing it, WYSIWYG, it's what you see is what you get. So that idea of I'm dragging and dropping components on a page, like the page layout, page builder for backend Salesforce, that kind of thing. I'm dragging and dropping the elements I want, and I'm looking at the page I'm building as I build it, and that's the experience that my users are going to see. It's a very much loved and often sought after feature for community stand-ups, for external facing experiences. Theirs is very robust. It's done very well. The other thing that's nice about it is the skill set to use the community builder is a Salesforce admin or developer style resource. So if you're already a Salesforce customer, if you already have in-house Salesforce IT, you've got a couple developers, you got a Salesforce admin, and you're like, I need to get an external experience out. I do not want to staff additional engineers or anything else. Experience Cloud, you buy it, and it basically takes you 80% of the way there, and the talent you already have can get that done. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, though, that could also be a problem. If you have an extremely busy internal Salesforce IT branch that's doing stuff for your sales team, for your marketing team, for other teams, by putting your community on Experience Cloud and putting this in their work stream, you might be dealing with bandwidth issues, bottlenecking in terms of like when are people rolling out these external facing updates you want. So it is an advantage. It can also be a drawback. You have to look at your internal staffing and think about that. But the idea, and this is why we call it the buy approach, is if you've got people to operate your Salesforce, buying Experience Cloud basically gets you as close to a finished community product as you're going to get.
Yeah. And it's interesting you bring that up, because when I think about it, when you're looking at like, well, hey, you know, Salesforce IT, I'm going to put this over here, but that's another thing for them to deal with. And it's interesting you bring it up like from a resource allocation standpoint. Like if you have a Salesforce partner like RadialSpark, please give us a call. I'll happy to give you a quote and support you guys. But like in all seriousness, like even if you're looking at this, it is not something people often think about, because Salesforce resources, even though Salesforce has grown tremendously over the last decade and is pretty ubiquitous throughout a lot of industries as a CRM, Salesforce developer resources are hard to find and are rare. And so when Justin brings up like the IT bandwidth issues and do I want to put this on Salesforce, although normally I would say, hey, if it's the best place for it, put it there rather than go build it somewhere else. But this might be something logistically that you have to think about. And the reason I bring it up is because we've seen that before within our own customers, where they're not able to manage and whatnot. And they'll either come to a third party like us and say, hey, we need help. My guys don't have time to deal with this particular thing, or the full expertise to take full advantage of the community tools. One thing I'd like to bring to, like you did bring up briefly beyond the WYSIWYG and the buy approach, is the app exchange. As our Salesforce companies know, our customers should know and are familiar with what the app exchange brings to the table. The really cool thing when you're building on Experience Cloud and you're building communities there is that the app exchange gives you fully baked, pre-built applications and add-ons that you can point and click your way and incorporate and provision users for into your community with the UI, depending on the app that you choose. But it's like pretty much it's a full applet that you're able to deploy out of the gate. Business people understand them. It's easy to install, basic admin skill set, like ton of advantages. And so when you look at the build versus buy, when you're evaluating, hey, I want to build my Experience Cloud and I want to be able to do these 5 features, these 5 things I need to have my community do. 3 of them might be just purchases away on the app exchange, like fully fleshed out, some minor configuration over the course of a couple of weeks, and you plug it into your Experience Cloud and you're good to go. There is a Heroku related,
I would say
tool
it's
for that.
almost equivalent, not quite.
I didn't want to
that
say
was
equivalent.
literally where the gears were turning in my head.
It's not.
So
It's
I'm
not
glad you
equivalent.
called it out.
It's not equivalent, because the thing is, when you look at the app exchange, you're looking at, think of like going to the supermarket and you're like, I'm just going to pick up a frozen dinner, and then I'm just going to throw it in the, throw it on the stove, and boom, it's done, right? Like it's that quick. Like you're up and running.
You can reuse the Lightning Web components, the
Yeah.
S objects. You like everything that you get in the back of your Salesforce org, like your Sales Cloud, your Service Cloud, everything that the managed package gives you there typically can be made accessible to your community in the exact same format, which is kind of unprecedented. Like third-party add-ons for back office also being available to like front office or external facing experiences. And the Heroku almost equivalent, which we'll get into, it'll be able to do that for data. It won't be able to do that for the Lightning components in the UI.
Yeah, and the analogy I was going to bring, and I'll let you go into the technical details, is that the Heroku version of this, it's called its Elements Marketplace, and Justin will go into exactly like what it brings to the table. But as opposed to going to the supermarket and picking up all the raw ingredients and doing everything yourself, it's like, hey, there's some diced onions, there's some prepackaged stuff that I'm going to build this recipe that is like, it's already somewhat prepared, but it's not as easy as throwing this in a microwave or throwing it on the stove and being done. You have to put the pieces together. And
that's took this in a slightly different direction than I thought you were going to take it, actually, because to that point, yes, there's the Elements Marketplace, which I'm going to talk about, but I was even actually thinking more, if you're building your experience, like your community on Heroku, and let's say you are looking at business feature sets, so you're like, oh, I need this for my experience, and I need this for my back office, and I buy an App Exchange product. So the App Exchange product will be fully available typically in both Sales Service Cloud as well as any Experience Cloud communities. If you're building your community on Heroku, you buy that App Exchange product, all of the S objects in that product can still be connected through Heroku Connect in your Heroku experience, but the Lightning components, the UI, the customizations they built native to the Salesforce platform, those don't connect over. So that's why it's like a partial match. But as the other thing that you called out, the Elements Marketplace is Heroku's counterpoint to Salesforce's App Exchange, but as they call it, like Salesforce's App Exchange is an app exchange. Heroku's Elements Marketplace is selling either services or infrastructure resources to add on to your application to deliver something. So as an example, and I'm just going to use this one because this is top of mind for me, anybody who has heard of like Financial Force or Certinia, setting that up on Salesforce, that's a managed package that gets installed onto the Force.com platform. And it is a accounting PSA, like it's basically a full-on ERP system. Very impressive. It is an app. On the Heroku Elements Marketplace, like the kinds of things you would buy there would be memory storage or database, or on the higher end, like a service, it might be Mailgun, SendGrid, something that's like, oh, this is my email service, this is how I'm going to make my app send emails. And so you can kind of see like the idea of, oh, SendGrid to send emails versus a fully baked ERP. These are not the same things being sold in these marketplaces. Yeah, and that's a really good call out, Mike.
Well, and that's what I was saying. It's like when you look at like from a recipe standpoint, it's like I'm buying diced onions instead of a raw onion and doing it all myself. It's like I'm buying some of the pre-baked ingredients, but really like
you
most
still
of
have
the
to do
meal is
some
gonna be on
cooking.
me. Yeah. Like I'm gonna do a lot of cooking, more than just toss it in a microwave, which is where the App Exchange kind of is. Like you buy Financial Force, you configure it. You set up your permissions and you go. Well, Financial Force is probably a bad example for that, but for other less complicated and thorough apps, it's like plug and play, right? And you're off to the races. But the good point that you did bring out, which I like wasn't thinking about again, I was talking more about the difference between the buy and the build approach, is that even if you buy these things on the App Exchange, as Justin mentioned, you can expose the data to your Heroku portal. So again, this kind of comes down to it's not always an either or. It's often sometimes
There is a lot of nuance.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance. But again, for like the very specific, like, hey, it needs to be an either or. I'm not going to build this twice, or I don't have a very complicated use case. I want to use the App Exchange. I want pre-built apps. I'm going to plug in a bunch of pre-baked things and make my meal that way. Experience Cloud's the way to go. If you're like, hey, I want to customize the heck out of this. I want to do different integrations. I want to incorporate all this other stuff. And I also might want to buy some stuff from the App Exchange too and synchronize that data over here. Heroku's your way. Like you're the executive chef. No one tells you how to do anything. Like you're just going to make it all yourself.
It's your kitchen, you're in charge.
Exactly. And I think that's where, like, to wrap up the buy versus build, unless I miss anything, like that's really
there were a few things I wanted to touch on, elaborate on the build for Heroku. And before we did, I had one final sentence I wanted to say on the buy approach, because we were talking about the IT bandwidth before we went down this rabbit hole. And I just wanted to say one thing to explain why I think IT bandwidth is important, specifically when you're talking about a community. So when you're juggling resource allocation for like your Salesforce team, the things getting done, it's kind of understood that you can like, oh, I need something for an internal team. If it takes longer than expected, like they'll deal with it. But if you have external facing communities and you're trying to get content updates out, you're trying to get things done, timeliness matters more externally facing than it does internally. That's just, one of the truths of business. And so if you've got an already stretched thin Salesforce team, this is why the bandwidth thing matters, is because if you're trying to have a timely and prompt experience that's like putting out new content the day that it matters and your team's already bogged down, they will underdeliver on that front and you're not going to be getting the value you expected. Having different resources, different team. So that's where I wanted to end on, just the buy piece with the Experience Cloud. To touch on the reason why we call Heroku build, and we've done a lot of comparisons. I just don't feel like we laid the foundation. We call Heroku the build approach because Heroku, in its simplest terms, is a Salesforce-owned platform as a service built on top of AWS infrastructure as a service, period, end of sentence. So anything that you would ever consider doing on AWS where you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to spin up my own private network and I'm going to do this, that, and the other, like Heroku does that. Heroku lets you do that. Heroku private spaces or AWS VPCs, all of this. So when you're playing in the Heroku space, you get all that control over your different infrastructure aspects. You have some of it automated for you because it is a platform and not infrastructure as a service. So you don't necessarily need an infrastructure engineer or a network engineer, but you're controlling your IP whitelisting. You're controlling all of these different aspects of what can talk to what else, where. And the resources you're going to use to do that are going to be more traditional web developers. So that's why we look at that as the build approach.